Tokyo, January 7, 1946. A biting wind, the karakazi, howls through the skeletal remains of the Shitamachi district, carrying the scent of frozen ash and the metallic tang of starvation. In the pre-dawn gray, the city is a monochromatic graveyard of charred timber and rusted corrugated iron. For the residents of this wasteland, fire is not a chemical reaction. It is a sentient, vengeful deity that has defined their existence for centuries. They remember the night of March 10, 1945, when the sky turned a bruised purple and the air itself ignited, melting the asphalt and turning the Sumida River into a boiling cauldron. To a Japanese civilian in these ruins, fire is the ultimate inevitability, a force that arrives on wings of B-29s or through the tipped charcoal brazier of a hungry neighbor. There is no defense against it, only the frantic, hopeless rhythm of the bucket brigade and the silent prayer for a shift in the wind. This profound fatalism was the bedrock of the Japanese home front. The architecture of the capital, fragile, intricate, and composed almost entirely of wood and paper, was a testament to a culture that viewed life as a fleeting blossom. The government's fire defense strategy had been largely psychological, emphasizing the Yamato spirit over mechanical capability. Civilians were trained to stand their ground with hand pumps and wet mats against a firestorm that could liquefy glass. This was the expectation, that when the flames came, one fought with spirit until the spirit was consumed. There was no concept of a systematic, industrial shield. The scorched earth was simply the price of existence in a world of fragile boundaries. But on this freezing morning, the silence of the ruins is shattered by a sound that does not belong to the vocabulary of the defeated. It is the rhythmic, heavy thrum of high-displacement internal combustion engines. Down the cleared arterial roads, painted a startling, aggressive red that contrasts sharply with the gray-black rubble, comes the vanguard of the American occupation's fire engineering units. These are not the repurposed delivery trucks or handcarts used by the local police. They are massive, gleaming symbols of Detroit's industrial surplus, La France and Mack pumpers, their chrome fittings polished to a mirror sheen despite the winter grit. To the watchers in the shadows, these machines appear less like tools and more like armored invaders. The American soldiers dismounting from the trucks move with a casual, terrifying confidence. They do not look like men who fear the fire. They look like men who have come to arrest it. They wear heavy, waterproof canvas coats and rigid helmets that catch the pale morning light. Their movements are practiced and devoid of the frantic energy that characterizes a Japanese fire response. They begin to unspool heavy, rubber-lined hoses, miles of them, it seems, stretching across the cracked pavement. This is the first ripple of a transformation. The Japanese civilian, clutching a threadbare coat against the wind, watches with a mixture of suspicion and awe. They expect the Americans to build walls, to set up checkpoints, to exert the weight of conquest. They do not expect a choreographed display of protection. As the Americans begin to tap into the subterranean hydrants, structures the civilians assumed were long dead or dry, the symbolic weight of the scene begins to shift. For years, the Japanese had been told that the Americans were a soft, decadent people, reliant on machines because they lacked the spiritual fortitude for a real struggle. Yet, seeing these soldiers methodically prepare to battle an abstract enemy like fire suggests a different truth. It suggests a civilization that regards the preservation of a single block of ruins as a task worthy of its highest technology. The stage is set for a collision between the ancient philosophy of the ash and the modern doctrine of the hydrant. The air, once filled only with the smell of the past, now carries the sharp, cold scent of pressurized water. The red behemoths did not merely roll into the Shitamachi, they occupied it with a mechanical arrogance that left the local populace paralyzed. To a resident of Tokyo, a vehicle of that size was a rarity, a luxury reserved for the highest echelons of the imperial military. Yet here, the Americans possessed dozens of them, idling with a deep guttural vibration that shook the loose rubble of the nearby ruins. These were the Type 750 and 1000 pumpers, machines built with the same industrial logic that had produced the tanks and bombers now occupying the airfields. Their brass gauges, glass-faced and precise, hinted at a mastery over pressure and volume that the Japanese civilian, accustomed to the erratic flow of hand-drawn wells, could scarcely comprehend. The contrast between the two worlds was most visible in the physical presence of the men and their tools. The Japanese neighborhood associations, or tanorigami, gathered at the edges of the cordoned-off drill zone. They were a collection of the hungry and the exhausted, dressed in patched mont trousers and faded military tunics. Their primary firefighting tool was the shobaguchi, a simple manual pump, or more often, the simple wooden bucket. For decades, they had been told that these buckets, when swung with enough patriotic fervor, could extinguish the fires of hell. Standing before the American trucks, the buckets looked like toys from a forgotten era. The Americans, by comparison, appeared as giants of nutrition and logistics. They were well-fed, their skin clear, their hands protected by thick leather gloves, a resource so scarce in Japan that it was practically non-existent. As the American fire marshal, a man with a silver whistle and a clipboard, gave the first command, the red trucks roared into a higher gear. The civilians flinched, conditioned by years of air raids to associate the sound of high-powered engines with impending destruction. But instead of the whistle of falling canisters, there was the sharp, metallic clatter of couplings. The U.S. soldiers worked in pairs, throwing their weight into the heavy hoses with a nonchalance that suggested this was merely a routine chore. They were not just preparing to spray water, they were assembling a high-pressure plumbing system on top of a graveyard. The documented records of the occupation show that these drills were part of a broader Fire Prevention Week initiative, designed to stabilize the city's volatile living conditions, but to the observers, it was a display of sheer, overwhelming power. A specific focal point for the crowd's attention was the deck gun, a massive, swivel-mounted nozzle fixed to the top of the pumper. It looked like a weapon of war, a cannon designed to fire liquid instead of steel. When the operator gripped the handles, it was with the posture of a machine gunner. There was a growing murmur among the elders in the crowd. They had been told the Americans were wasteful and lacked the discipline of the Japanese soul. Yet, here was a level of discipline that was terrifying in its efficiency. Every movement was calculated to minimize time. Every tool had a specific, designated bracket on the truck. The chaos of the bucket brigade, with its shouting and spilled water, was nowhere to be found. The air was soon filled with the mist of a fine spray as the pumps were tested. This was not the brownish, silt-heavy water of the local canals, but a clear, forceful stream drawn from the restored deep-pressure mains. To the Japanese who had spent the last year searching for clean water to drink, the sight of hundreds of gallons being cycled through a machine for a mere drill was a shock to the psyche. It was the first tangible evidence that the American arsenal of democracy was not just a propaganda slogan. It was a reality that could be measured in horsepower and gallons per minute. The red behemoths were not just there to fight fires. They were there to extinguish the last remaining illusions of the old order. The geometry of safety began with a chalk line and a transit level. The Japanese civilians, gathered in a respectful but wary semicircle, watched as an American lieutenant from the Army Engineers paced out a precise grid across the scorched earth of a vacant lot. He wasn't looking at the sky for omens or praying for rain. He was calculating the physics of a kill zone for fire. In the old world of Tokyo, firefighting was reactive and emotional, a desperate struggle to save one's own family shrine while the neighbor's house collapsed. The Americans, however, treated the city like a giant laboratory. They mapped out the wind corridors between the remaining brick chimneys and calculated the exact radius of protection offered by each pumper's reach. This was the introduction of spatial engineering to a populace that had only ever known the chaos of the inferno. The civilians watched as the soldiers erected portable folding tanks, made of heavy, waterproofed canvas. These were filled within minutes, creating artificial ponds where none had existed before. The sight was deeply unsettling to those who had seen their children die of thirst during the firestorms. To the Americans, water was a commodity to be moved, stored, and deployed with the same cold logic as ammunition. The lieutenant pointed to a map of the district, showing the onlookers how they had identified fire breaks that would be reinforced by these water walls. Historical data from the period suggests that the U.S. fire marshals were shocked by the density of the Japanese slums, but their response was not to despair. It was to impose a rigid Western order upon the sprawl. There was a chilling precision in the way the hoses were laid out, parallel lines that resembled the tracks of a railroad, leading toward a singular objective. This was the geometry that the Japanese had never considered. In their tradition, fire was a flowing, organic monster. To the Americans, it was a mathematical problem. By placing the trucks at specific intervals and cross-linking the hoses, they created a redundant system where the failure of one pump would not break the defense. The civilians whispered among themselves, noting how the soldiers measured the distance from the hydrants with steel tapes. It was a level of preparation that suggested the Americans valued the charred remains of Shitamachi as much as if it were a suburb in Ohio. This meticulousness began to erode the civilian perception of the lazy American. The soldiers were sweating in the freezing air, their movements sharp and repetitive. They practiced advancing the line, a drill where a team of 4 men moved a charged, heavy hose up a ladder toward a simulated roofline. The ladder itself was a marvel, an aluminum extension that reached heights the Japanese wooden ladders could never achieve. As the ladder slid upward with a rhythmic clack, 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 the crowd looked up, following the silver line against the gray sky. For the first time, they were looking up at something American that wasn't carrying a bomb bay. The drill concluded with the marking of safe zones, areas where civilians were instructed to gather if the sirens wailed. The Americans used bright, reflective paint to mark the asphalt. This was a radical departure from the imperial instructions, which usually commanded civilians to stay and fight the fire regardless of the risk. By creating a plan that prioritized evacuation and mechanical containment over human sacrifice, the Americans were subtly introducing the concept of the individual's worth. The geometry of safety was not just about water and hoses. It was about the revolutionary idea that a city could be engineered to protect its people, rather than asking its people to die for the city. The chalk lines on the soot-stained ground were the first blueprints of a different kind of future. The brass nozzle, heavy and cold, became the undisputed focal point of the morning's demonstration. It was a massive, machined instrument of yellow metal, polished until it glowed with a golden light that seemed defiant against the winter gloom. When the American nozzleman stepped forward, he gripped the device not as a simple pipe, but as a precision weapon. In the hand-pump culture of Japan, water was something that was coaxed, sputtered, and thrown. It was a weak, thinning stream that barely reached the second story of a burning tenement. But the American nozzle was a masterpiece of hydraulic engineering, capable of twisting from a wide, protective fog to a solid, shattering, straight stream with a single flick of a wrist. To the Japanese civilians, this object was the ultimate symbol of abundance. While they lived in a world where every scrap of metal had been surrendered to the war effort, where even the temple bells had been melted down for shell casings, the Americans had enough brass to create these heavy, intricate tools for the mere purpose of fire safety. The nozzle was a physical manifestation of a nation that did not have to choose between guns and butter, or between tanks and fire engines. It represented a civilization that could afford to invest tons of premium alloy into the protection of civilian infrastructure. As the sun caught the curve of the brass, it reflected a reality that shattered the propaganda of Western scarcity. The sound of the water hitting the nozzle was the next revelation. As the pumper throttled up, the hose behind the nozzleman swelled and stiffened, becoming as rigid as a structural beam. The water didn't just flow, it roared through the brass with a predatory hiss. When the bail was opened, the kickback was so intense that 2 men had to brace behind the nozzleman, their boots digging into the cracked pavement. The resulting stream was a solid pillar of white water that tore through the air with a velocity that could strip the tiles off a roof. The onlookers gasped, stepping back as the mist from the impact drifted over them like a cold rain. This was the power of a nation that had mastered the elements, turning the very water into a kinetic force. Beyond its power, the nozzle represented a command over resources. The Americans demonstrated the fog pattern, a technique where the nozzle was adjusted to create a wide, circular shield of fine droplets. This was designed to protect the firefighters from the intense radiant heat of a blaze. To the Japanese, who had only ever known the scorched skin and singed hair of the firestorm, the idea of a water shield was miraculous. It was a scientific application of water that prioritized the survival of the operator. The recurring sound of the brass bale clicking open and shut, a solid mechanical thwack, echoed through the silent ruins, a rhythmic reminder of American technical supremacy. This single tool, the brass nozzle, spoke volumes more than any occupation leaflet could. It told the story of a democracy that protected its own with the weight of its industry. The Japanese elders, who had spent decades being told that spiritual purity was superior to material wealth, looked at the nozzle and saw the lie. Spirit could not stop a firestorm, but this brass instrument, backed by the roaring engines and the endless supply of the hydrants, could. The nozzle was not just a piece of equipment, it was the key to a new ideology. It was the promise that, under this new order, the flames would no longer be a vengeful god, but a problem that could be solved with the right tool and enough resolve. The golden glow of the brass was the first light of a new, industrial peace. The crowd of onlookers stood in a tense, vibrating silence as the American crews moved deeper into the residential ruins. For many Japanese civilians, this was a moment of profound psychological friction. They had been raised on a steady diet of propaganda that depicted the blue-eyed devils as a race of sadistic barbarians who took pleasure in the incineration of Japanese cities. As the soldiers began to approach still-standing wooden structures with their heavy equipment, a ripple of terror went through the neighborhood. Mothers pulled their children closer, and old men gripped their walking sticks, bracing for a new kind of cruelty. They expected the drill to be a cruel ruse, perhaps a demonstration of how easily the Americans could wash away what little they had left, or a prelude to a new wave of forced demolitions to make way for military runways. This expectation of brutality was not just a product of propaganda, it was the trauma of the previous year. To see the same men who had dropped the napalm now wielding the hoses was a cognitive dissonance that few could resolve in an instant. However, as the drill progressed, the expected violence never materialized. Instead, the civilians witnessed a strange, meticulous kindness. An American sergeant, his face smudged with engine grease, signaled for his men to stop. He pointed to a small, lopsided shack where an elderly woman was trying to move a heavy ceramic water jar out of the path of the hoses. Two GIs immediately dropped their line and ran over, not to shove her aside, but to lift the jar for her, placing it safely behind a stone wall before returning to their post with a casual wave. The internal shift began in small, documented ripples of realization. The civilians watched as the fire marshals carefully draped heavy tarps over the exposed tatami mats of a partially collapsed house to protect them from the practice spray. They were not there to destroy, they were there to train for the preservation of the shitamachi. This was a radical departure from the total war mindset that had governed Japan for a decade. In the imperial era, the individual home was a secondary concern to the glory of the state. If a neighborhood had to burn to create a firebreak, it burned. But the Americans were treating these drills as a safeguard for the coming winter, when the dry winds would make the charcoal braziers of the poor a deadly threat to the entire district. Historical evidence from occupation journals highlights the confusion of the Japanese populace during these early interactions. They saw the enemy, teaching them how to organize their own neighborhood fire watches according to Western standards. The Americans were sharing the science of the flashpoint and the chemistry of combustion. They were providing the civilians with the very knowledge needed to prevent the kind of catastrophes the B-29s had once caused. This was a sophisticated form of psychological warfare, though perhaps unintentional. It demonstrated that the Americans were so confident in their victory that they could afford to be the benevolent protectors of their former foes. The expectation of brutality was slowly replaced by a sense of bewildered gratitude. The civilians realized that the decadent Americans possessed a strange, rigorous morality regarding the safety of the common man. The drills were not a show of force, but a lesson in civic responsibility. By the time the noon whistle blew, the fear in the crowd had evaporated, replaced by an intense, analytical curiosity. They began to see the American soldiers not as demons, but as engineers of a new reality, a reality where the fire was no longer a tool of the state or a curse of the gods, but a manageable risk in a society that valued the survival of its citizens. The transition from victim to student had begun in the shadow of the red trucks. The climax of the day's demonstration arrived at the central square, a rare expanse of open ground cleared of its usual mountain of debris. The American fire marshal raised a hand, and the low thrum of the pumpers surged into a high-pitched, mechanical scream. On cue, 6 separate hose teams braced themselves, their boots locked against the pavement in a wide, athletic stance. As the bales were thrown open, 6 massive pillars of water erupted into the freezing air, converging at a central point high above the ruins. This was the wall of water, a literal curtain of liquid that blotted out the gray skyline and created a roaring, translucent barrier that seemed to defy the very laws of nature. The scale of the display was a physical assault on the senses. To the Japanese civilians, water had always been a scarce, precious resource, carried in buckets or pumped by hand with agonizing effort. To see it deployed with such reckless, industrial volume was a revelation of American logistical might. The water did not just fall, it pounded against the air, creating a microclimate of mist and rainbows that drifted over the scorched district. Historical records from the occupation suggest that these mass-flow demonstrations were intended to prove that no fire, no matter how intense, could breach a properly engineered American defense. It was a projection of an impenetrable democracy, manifested through the sheer weight of H2O. As the wall of water reached its full height, the symbolic power of the scene became undeniable. For years, the people of Tokyo had been told to rely on the divine wind, the kamikaze, to protect their shores from the invaders. But the wind had never come, and the fires had consumed their world. Now, standing in the ruins of that failure, they were looking at a man-made miracle that was far more reliable than any myth. The American wall of water was tangible, scientific, and repeatable. It represented a nation that did not wait for gods to intervene, but instead built the pumps and forged the pipes to intervene on its own behalf. The roaring sound of the water, like a constant, localized thunderstorm, drowned out the whispers of the old world. The precision of the formation was equally startling. The 6 streams met with such accuracy that the water seemed to freeze into a solid, shimmering dome before cascading down. The soldiers controlling the lines moved with a synchronized grace, adjusting their angles to compensate for the wind. This was the industrialization of courage. In the Japanese tradition, the firefighter was a lone hero, a man who ran into the flames with a mat and a prayer. The Americans were something else entirely. They were components of a vast, integrated machine. Their bravery was not a frantic outburst, but a calm, methodical application of training and technology. The wall of water was the final product of a system that prioritized efficiency over individual sacrifice. For the onlookers, the wall of water became a mirror of their own defeat and a window into a new ideology. They realized that the war had not been a contest of spirit, but a collision of systems. The American system could produce a wall of water in the middle of a starving city, while the Japanese system could barely provide a bowl of rice. As the mist settled on the upturned faces of the crowd, the coldness of the water felt like a cleansing. The wall was not a barrier to keep them out, it was a shield to keep them safe. The roaring abundance of the Americans had finally extinguished the last sparks of the old fire, leaving behind a clear, wet space where a new kind of society could begin to breathe. The transition from awe to education began as the roar of the wall of water subsided, replaced by the sharp, rhythmic commands of the American fire marshals. The soldiers did not simply pack their equipment and depart. Instead, they began to beckon the leaders of the local neighborhood associations, the Tonarigami, into the drill zone. For the Japanese civilians, this was an unprecedented breach of the traditional hierarchy. In the imperial system, technical knowledge was a guarded secret of the state, and the common man was expected to obey, not to understand. Yet, the Americans were now inviting soot-stained laborers and former clerks to handle the brass nozzles and inspect the mechanical gauges. This was the introduction of a democratic logistics, where the safety of the neighborhood was placed directly into the hands of its residents. The GIs began a series of impromptu workshops, using basic gestures and translated pamphlets to teach the science of fire suppression. They demonstrated the three elements of fire: heat, fuel, and oxygen, treating the once mystical deity of destruction as a simple chemical equation that could be solved. The civilians watched with intense, analytical focus as a sergeant showed them how to maintain a pressurized hydrant and why a steady, low-pressure stream was often more effective than a frantic, wasted splash. Documentation from these early occupation months reveals that the Japanese were remarkably quick studies, their traditional discipline easily pivoting toward these new, logical frameworks. They were learning that the defense of their homes was no longer a matter of spiritual endurance, but of valve maintenance and hose hygiene. The American soldiers emphasized the importance of the pressurized hydrant over the manual labor of the bucket brigade. They explained that a single well-maintained hydrant was worth 1,000 men with wooden pails. To a populace that had been conditioned to believe that human effort was the only true currency of the state, this was a revolutionary concept. It suggested that a society's strength was measured not by how much its people suffered, but by how well it utilized its infrastructure to prevent that suffering. The recurring symbol of American democracy, abundance, was now being framed as a tool for the common good. The Americans were not just providing the water, they were providing the intellectual plumbing required to manage it. As the afternoon progressed, the drills became collaborative. Young Japanese men were invited to help flake the hoses, learning the specific folding patterns that ensured a line wouldn't kink under pressure. There was a strange, silent camaraderie in these moments. The language barrier was bridged by the universal logic of the machine. When a Japanese civilian successfully coupled a hose to a pumper and heard the solid click of the locking ring, a small, tentative smile would often break through the mask of defeat. They were realizing that these tools were not inherently American, they were universal. The science of safety belonged to anyone with the discipline to master the mechanics. By the time the sun began to dip behind the jagged horizon of the ruins, the neighborhood had been transformed into a classroom. The lessons in logistics had replaced the frantic desperation of the past with a burgeoning sense of agency. The civilians were no longer just survivors of a firestorm. They were becoming the new guardians of their own streets. The American fire safety drills had successfully shifted the perception of the occupation from one of pure military control to one of civic partnership. The realization was taking root. The Americans were not just occupiers of the land, but architects of a new, safer way of life, built on the steady, reliable flow of organized resources. The psychological fracture occurred in the profound silence that followed the final test of the afternoon. For the elders of the Shitamachi, men who had lived through the Meiji, Taisho, and Showa eras, the sight of the American fire engineering units created a rift in their understanding of the universe. For years, the imperial government had preached the doctrine of Seishin, or spiritual power, claiming that the Japanese soul was a fire that could never be extinguished by the material wealth of the West. They had been told that the Americans were a soft, machine-dependent people who would crumble when faced with the divine wind. But as the sun set over the ruins, reflecting off the chrome of the motionless pumpers, the elders realized that they had been fundamentally deceived. The divine wind had never arrived to stop the B-29s, yet the Americans had brought a man-made wind of water that could stop the very fires the war had birthed. The realization was a crushing blow to the ideology of fatalism. In the Japanese tradition, the destruction of a city was often viewed as a natural cycle, an inevitable rebirth through flame. This belief had allowed the populace to endure the unendurable, but it had also left them defenseless. Seeing the Americans treat fire as a manageable risk rather than a divine curse forced a reassessment of what it meant to be a modern nation. The psychological fracture lay in the discovery that the Americans did not just have more resources, they had a more compassionate relationship with those resources. They used their industrial might to protect the mundane, the small shop, the family home, the narrow alleyway. To a civilian who had been told to die for the emperor, the sight of an American soldier sweating to save a Japanese shack was a subversion of everything they knew about power. Historical records from the occupation period frequently note this shift in civilian morale. The decadent Americans were revealed to be masters of a rigorous, scientific discipline that surpassed the frantic bravery of the Japanese home front. The fracture was most evident when the civilians compared the American fire drills to their own memories of the total war training. They remembered the uselessness of the bamboo spears and the clay firebombs they had been told to use against the B-29s. In contrast, the American equipment was logical, effective, and profoundly expensive. The realization was bitter. The war had not been a contest of who had the stronger spirit, but a contest of who valued the lives of their citizens enough to build a better hydrant. This shift in perception was not merely about technology. It was about the recurring symbol of American abundance as a guarantor of freedom. The civilians began to understand that a nation that could afford to waste thousands of gallons of water on a safety drill was a nation that could never be defeated by spirit alone. Abundance was not a sign of softness. It was a weapon of stability. The psychological fracture allowed for the first seeds of democratic thought to take root. If the Americans were right about the science of the flame, perhaps they were also right about the science of the state. The old world of sacrifice and fire was cooling, leaving behind a space for a new philosophy built on the protection of the individual. As the dusk deepened, the red trucks glowed like embers in the dark. The elders watched the soldiers pack their gear, noting the ease with which they handled their heavy burdens. The fracture was complete. The myth of the divine wind had been extinguished by the reality of the pressurized hose. The Japanese civilians were no longer looking back at the glory of a burning empire. They were looking forward, with a wary but intense curiosity, at a world where the water always flowed and the fire was a problem that could be solved. The silence of the ruins was no longer the silence of the grave, but the quiet, contemplative air of a people beginning to imagine a different kind of strength. The transition from theory to terrifying reality occurred just as the American crews were preparing to withdraw for the evening. A plume of thick, oily black smoke erupted from a cluster of surviving wooden shops 2 blocks to the east, followed by the frantic screams of "Kaji," the ancient Japanese cry of fire. The winter wind, which had been a nuisance all morning, suddenly became a lethal catalyst, whipping the sparks toward a row of crowded tenements. In the old days, this would have been the beginning of a neighborhood's extinction, a slow-motion disaster fought with frantic shouts and leaking buckets. But before the first Japanese resident could even reach for a pail, the air was split by the rising, mechanical wail of the American sirens. The response was a masterclass in the industrialization of courage. The red pumpers did not hesitate. They pivoted with a roaring agility that seemed impossible for their size. The same soldiers who had been casually demonstrating hose folds moments before were suddenly transformed into a high-speed engine of intervention. There was no panic, no screaming, and no wasted motion. As the first pumper screeched to a halt near the burning shop, the crew hit the pavement running. Within 45 seconds, a time frame documented with astonishment by local observers, A heavy, pressurized line was charged and the first wall of water was being hammered into the base of the seat of the fire. The Japanese civilians watched, frozen in a state of shock, as the American nozzlemen stepped directly into the heat that would have sent a bucket brigade retreating in terror. Protected by their heavy canvas coats and the fog-pattern shield they had demonstrated earlier, the GIs pushed forward. The fire, which had been feasting on dry cedar and paper, hissed and buckled under the sheer kinetic force of the American stream. It was not a struggle. It was an execution. The massive volume of water did not just dampen the flames. It drowned them, stripping the heat from the structures and preventing the dreaded jump to the neighboring roofs. This specific incident, where a drill turned into a life-saving intervention, cemented a shift in civilian loyalty that no amount of propaganda could undo. The residents of the shops, men and women who had lost everything in the bombings, stood weeping as they watched their livelihoods being saved by the very men they had been taught to hate. The speed of the intervention was a revelation. To the Americans, the saving of these shops was a technical problem requiring 5 minutes of effort. To the Japanese, it was a miracle that preserved their survival. The new Guardians had proven their worth not with words, but with the overwhelming reality of the brass nozzle and the deep-pressure hydrant. As the steam rose from the blackened but standing remains of the shop, the American sergeant simply nodded to the shopkeeper and began the process of rolling up the hoses. There was no demand for payment, no lecture on imperial duty, and no expectation of subservience. The soldiers were simply professionals who had completed a task. This casual efficiency was perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of the event. It suggested a world where the state existed to serve the people, and where the protection of a humble merchant was a standard operating procedure. The new Guardians had extinguished the fire, but in doing so, they had lit a different kind of flame in the hearts of the onlookers, a realization that under the American shadow, the nights might finally be safe. The legacy of the flame began in the steam rising from the cooling embers of Shitamachi. As the American pumpers finally withdrew into the darkening silhouette of the city, they left behind more than just wet pavement and standing walls. They left a blueprint for a new Japanese society. The fire safety drills of 1946 were the first tremors of a reconstruction that would prioritize the safety of the common man over the expansionist dreams of the state. The charred ruins, once seen as a testament to the inevitable cycle of destruction, were now viewed as a foundation for a modern, fireproof infrastructure. The lessons in logistics and the science of the hydrant became the cornerstones of a new civil service, as the Japanese people adopted the American methods with a rigor that would eventually make their own fire departments some of the most efficient in the world. The recurring symbol of American abundance, once viewed with suspicion, was now understood as the essential fuel for democracy. The realization had taken hold that a free society was one that possessed the resources and the will to protect its citizens from the elemental terrors of the past. The wall of water had become a permanent mental fixture for the survivors. It represented the transition from a culture of fatalistic sacrifice to one of engineered resilience. This shift was the true end of the war. The fire was no longer an act of God or a weapon of the emperor, but a manageable consequence of urban life, controlled by the steady hand of science and the reliable flow of shared resources. In the decades that followed, as the wood and paper of old Tokyo gave way to the steel and concrete of a global metropolis, the memory of the red trucks remained a poetic reflection on the nature of liberation. The Japanese civilians had learned that freedom was not just a political abstract. It was the ability to sleep through the night without the fear of the Hai-no-yojin. The drills had been an education in the value of the individual, proving that the greatest strength of a nation lay in its capacity to preserve the lives of its humblest residents. The abundance of the West had not arrived to crush the Japanese spirit, but to provide it with a shield, allowing it to grow in a world defined by safety rather than soot. The epilogue of the Tokyo fire drills is written in the skyline of the modern city, a testament to the triumph of engineering over ideology. The larger truth revealed in the freezing winds of 1946 was that democracy is, at its heart, a system of logistics, a commitment to ensuring that the water always reaches the flame and that no citizen is ever asked to stand alone against the inferno. The legacy of the flame was its ultimate extinction, replaced by a cold, clear, and enduring peace. The red behemoths had long since rusted away, but the realization they brought stayed behind, that true power is measured not by how much a nation can burn, but by how much it can save.